We've had a long boom, and I think we're going to have a long bust in most stock prices.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Doug, we're seeing protests all across the world due to inflation and the cost of living crisis, places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Argentina, etc. Why aren't we seeing it in the US yet?
Oh, but you will. The reason that we're not seeing it in the US is perhaps in fact, it's because the Biden regime has printed up trillions of new dollars and dispensed them to the country so that this has allowed people to live above their means for even longer. In other words, if you put $10,000 in everybody's bank account right now, uh, tomorrow morning, they'd wake up and they think, wow, uh, I'm rich. We'll go out and spend, live high off the hog. And
Right.
this is what's happened with a much greater degree because we're talking about trillions of dollars. So it's a delayed reaction in the US. The US government has been far more profligate than any other government. And the answer to the question is it's uh, it's all going to fall apart because the result has been very high levels of inflation. Real inflation in this country is running not just the 7, 8, 9%, whatever that number they've come up with. It's really more like 15%, approaching 20%.
Right.
Yeah, so the good times are going to come to an end, and the natives are going to get very restless quite soon, I think. Certainly in time for the elections in October, which are very, very worrying.
We're living in really interesting times, Doug, and there are multiple crises one after another. What is Doug Casey right now doing to protect his wealth in these dangerous financial times?
Well, the stock market is coming down, and I think it's going to continue going down for some time. Don't forget that we've had essentially a 40-year bull market in both stocks and bonds and real estate since interest rates last peaked in the early 1980s, which you may recall, most people don't, was when the US government was paying 15 or 16 or 17% for its money. So we've had a long boom, and I think we're going to have a long bust in most stock prices. The only things that are cheap today are commodity prices. So I'm trying to get long commodities
Hmm.
uh, and commodity production stocks. Uh, I'm looking for things that are cheap to buy, and that's about it. Commodities and commodity producing companies.
Are you looking at any specific ones? Like any are you going more silver or gold miners? Like what are you looking for? Large cap?
I don't think any silver miners are making any money at this point. Uh, but that means that it's a good time to buy them because in terms of speculative potential, I think silver is very ripe right now. I've been saying for some years that gold was in an equilibrium area, and that's true of silver too. Uh, Relative to everything, and don't forget, gold from 1971 has gone from $35 to, let's say, $1,700, $1,800.
Hmm.
That's 50 times in 50 years. That's actually not bad. Uh, so that it's at an equilibrium level. I think it's going higher. I think silver's going higher. But, this isn't the days when you could buy gold at $35 and find it ran 20 to 1, which it did from 1971 to 1980. Those days are over. What am I buying in particular? Just underpriced producers of gold uh, and silver and copper, which I actually like more than silver
Hmm.
in many ways right now. I own a lot of Newmont, own a lot of Barrick. These are the big ones.
Yeah.
And of course, I've always bought a lot of exploration and development stocks, much riskier, but eventually the public is going to get onto the meme that gold is the only financial asset that's not simultaneously somebody else's liability. And they're going to start buying it en masse and
Right.
drive these stocks up 10 to 1 as a group, which has happened since the dollar was devalued by Nixon in 1971.
Right. Now, Doug, in a recent interview, you said you've been to about 155 countries and lived in about 10, which is really impressive. And you always said you want to have a plan B. Can you explain that for our audience?
Your major risks in the world today, obvious risks, are financial, market meltdown, yeah, very likely. Economic meltdown, almost inevitable and very, very serious. But as big as those risks are, your biggest risk is political. In other words, what is your government going to do to you? It's something that Russians should have been much more aware of in 1917,
Right.
and Germans should have been much more aware of in 1933, and the Vietnamese should have been much more aware of in the 1950s, and the Cubans in 1959. And there are scores of countries, and I'm afraid that at this point, the government in the US and in Canada, for that matter, you've essentially got people that have a Bolshevik style philosophy
Right.
in their minds. Philosophically, they're exactly the same people. The way they think politically, they're exactly the same people that took over France in 1793. Yeah, what you want to have is political diversification as well as financial and economic diversification. It means that if you're in a position to, you should have a crib in a second or a third country. I know most people aren't in that position, but they should get themselves in that position.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the country locks down, you're in a lot of trouble.
So let's go back into history to 1930s. Germany is an economic ruin, and one person comes along and promises change. Will we see another scenario like that in Europe if financial gets like really bad and there's high inflation and hyperinflation, if it gets to that level?
Chances are very high because the average person has been indoctrinated overtly and subtly over many decades into believing that government is the answer and socialism is the answer.
Right.
So that as inflation gets further out of control, it won't be blamed on the government. It'll be blamed on the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker, the oil maker. So they're going to look to the government to do something to make things better. And somebody, some political type, will present himself and say, give me enough power and I will straighten things out. And the voters will go that way. So chances are excellent. We're going to get strong men in many countries in the Western world, like Trudeau, but worse, like Biden, but worse.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the federal government in the 1900s, they took only 3% of GDP. Now they're controlling absolutely everything, and it's almost like a surveillance state, and it's more like 40 to 50%. How does this end, Doug, in your eyes? Does it end with a revolution? What do you see happening?
Well, there are several alternatives, of course. One is that we do have a revolution, that there are enough middle-class people left, there are less every day, small businessmen, people that are trying to make their way in the world, that just get fed up. But throughout history, peasant revolts almost always fail, almost always.
Really?
So that, yeah, they almost always, and we can go through the history of peasant revolts, starting with Wat Tyler's rebellion in England in, what was it, 1389. There have been a few that have succeeded, like the French Revolution.
Right.
That was a peasant revolt because people were starving, but that ended very badly. As bad as Louis XVI was, it got much worse under Robespierre. So they usually fail, but even when they succeed, it gets even worse. What are the chances that things are going to get better at this point? Well, I think we're going to go through some very tough times because there's an immense amount of debt in the world. Now, people recognize that, but what they don't recognize is that some people owe it to some other people. And when those some people can't pay it back to the other people, everybody gets very unhappy. People go into the street when they can't afford to drive their cars, when they lose their jobs. They're looking for political solutions to economic problems, which incidentally are politically caused. The prognosis is not good. What's going to happen exactly? All I can really predict is that we're going to see chaos. We're going to see financial chaos, economic chaos, political chaos.
Yeah.
And with what's going on in the Ukraine, I think we're going to see international chaos as well. And it's not going to be just the US and Canada. It's going to be all over the world.
So sooner or later, like right now, you don't see major protests in the U.S., but sooner or later, you think it'll catch up to U.S. and Canada?
Yeah, I do. Although maybe US and Canada are a little bit different from that point of view.
They've been indoctrined for too many years.
Yeah, they have, but you know, you got to recognize that 25% of the population is on psychoactive drugs, and I don't mean LSD and marijuana. I mean Zoloft and Prozac and a
Yeah.
hundred others like that. So they're kind of sedated at this point. That's one thing, and the younger people are, you know, after they get out of 4 years of indoctrination in college, well, a lot of them are just living in their mother's basements because that's what they can afford. You know, eating McDonald's, getting fat, uh, unlikely to go out and become street fighting men.
Right.
But look, anything can happen.
Yeah, no, anything can happen. I think sooner or later, like my personal opinion is inflation will get out of control. Like, what do you make of Biden forgiving all the student debt? Do you think that will eventually, how short-sighted is that?
Well, it's more than short-sighted. It's actually insane. Uh, you know, it's somebody makes a mistake, and it usually is a mistake, incidentally, to go to a college and drink beer and chase girls for 4 years. You can do that while you're working.
Right.
But to have it subsidized, encouraged, and then subsidized by the government, and then have that debt forgiven, well, it's immoral to start with. What about all the people that paid their debts in the past? Maybe you should give them a $10,000 or
Yeah.
however rebate because they paid their debt off.
Right.
It's crazy. And that money is owed to somebody. That loan was made. So where's that money going to come from? Well, the government's going to have to print it up to give to the banks or to the whatever lenders